Hey, ever wondered what education was like in the Middle Ages? If you love uncovering secrets from the past, hit that like button and subscribe to the channel. Don't miss what's coming next because the medieval history you've never heard before is starting now. Education in the Middle Ages has a peculiar beginning, marked by a completely different scenario from what we imagine today. In antiquity, education was primarily accessible to elites, but in the early Middle Ages, things were very different. Most children, especially in rural areas, did not attend schools. Why study if you were going to be a peasant working the fields or weaving baskets for the rest of your life? And more. The idea of schooling didn't always exist the way we understand it now. Formal education, as we know it, began to take shape within monasteries where monks were responsible for teaching. These monasteries became the centers of knowledge at the time, due to the Catholic Church, which had immense control over knowledge. So, what did children learn in these early moments? Boys, especially those from noble families, were sent to monasteries with the task of learning the basics, to read and write. But at a modest start, the teaching was almost entirely religious. The church held the key to knowledge, and education was seen as a means of spreading the faith in the Holy Scriptures. But it's important to remember that medieval schooling was not like the school we know today. Education was deeply tied to religious life, and training was directly linked to the monastery or convent where the student was. The Middle Ages, especially in its early centuries, was essentially a time when learning meant connecting with faith, and faith, in turn, was the gateway to knowledge. In England, for example, the first known educational institution was founded by King Alfred in the 9th century and aimed at preserving the knowledge of Roman and Christian culture. However, until the 11th and 12th centuries, most people still did not attend schools. Education during this period was accessible to a few, and even more so in some regions of Europe. For the lower classes, education was not a priority, as working the land or manual trades were the main occupations. What is fascinating is that even in the early days of the Middle Ages, there was an understanding that education was essential for the advancement of society, but it was completely shaped by the needs of the church and the worldview of the time. However, gradually, education began to expand, not only in monasteries but also in cathedrals, where the first cathedral schools emerged, aimed at training clergy. This beginning of medieval education was marked by exclusion, but also by the creation of a learning system that would sustain society for many centuries. Therefore, we can say that the seed of modern education was planted in the Middle Ages, but only in a fertile and restricted field, where the church ruled and determined what could or could not be taught. Monastery schools, where medieval education began to take shape, were very different environments from our current schools. While today we associate schools with spaces where knowledge spreads across various fields of study, in the medieval context, everything revolved around religion. The monastery was the center of learning, but above all, a place of prayer and meditation. Education was not viewed as something to prepare children for a career or life in society. It existed to train souls and prepare them for a religious life. Boys who entered monasteries, especially those from noble families, began their educational journey at a very young age. Around the age of 7, children were sent to these learning centers, where life was structured around prayer times and religious activities. They started their day very early, with the sound of bells announcing the hour for prayer. Thus, formal education began after prayers and focused on reading and writing, with an emphasis on Latin, the language of the church. Learning was not limited to memorizing religious texts but also included hymn singing. It was common for boys to participate in the choir, a practice that helped them learn new words and develop their musical skills. Reading psalms and other sacred texts was part of the daily curriculum, and the study of Latin was essential since it was the language of liturgy and academic texts. For those few who managed to learn more, there were also studies in basic arithmetic and philosophy, but always with a religious focus. The environment was austere, and discipline was strict. Youngsters who did not meet educational expectations were severely punished, often with physical punishment, such as the use of a rod or whip. Education was a true test of endurance. Despite the hardships, monasteries were, without a doubt, the most important places for education, and only a small portion of the population had access to this type of learning. What is even more interesting is that education was often just one part of the broader training for religious life, with children being prepared to eventually become monks, priests, or other members of the clergy. However, for children from poorer families, this education was a distant reality. Many of them didn't even have the chance to learn to read and write, as their lives were dedicated to hard work in the fields or in workshops. Thus, medieval education was undoubtedly marked by inequality, with the upper class having access to in-depth learning, while the poor were left behind. The Catholic Church played a central role in almost all aspects of medieval life, and education was no exception. In fact, the Church was the primary responsible entity for the educational system of the time. For much of the Middle Ages, education was viewed as a tool to reinforce the religious faith and transmit Christian teachings. Over the centuries, it monopolized access to knowledge and, with that, held immense power over medieval society. In monasteries, as we've seen, education was entirely geared towards religious principles. The curriculum focused on studying the Bible, sacred texts, and Christian philosophy. The cathedral schools, which began to emerge around the 12th century, also followed the same line. These schools were designed to form the clergy, and the greater goal was to ensure that future priests, bishops, and other clergy members had a deep understanding of Christian doctrine. Thus, teaching the Word of God was the priority, and any other type of knowledge, such as science or the arts, had to be justified within the religious context. Moreover, the Church was responsible for preserving much of the knowledge of antiquity, especially the legacy of Greek and Roman philosophers. Many classical texts were copied and preserved by monks, who kept them in their libraries. Without the Church, much of what we know about ancient philosophy and sciences could have been lost. The process of manuscript copying, in which monks spent hours copying texts by hand, was one of the primary means of disseminating knowledge in the Middle Ages. The Church was also responsible for creating the first universities in Europe, with a focus on theology, law, and medicine, all tied to the service of the Church. Medieval universities were spaces where students not only studied the scriptures but also prepared to serve the Church in various capacities, from priests to advisors and ecclesiastical administrators. Thus, the relationship between the Church and education in the Middle Ages was one of absolute control. By teaching and educating, the Church not only trained future religious leaders but also reinforced its own authority over all aspects of medieval life. It was, without a doubt, the guardian of knowledge, but this knowledge was always tied to its interpretation of religious truth. If someone was considered heretical or deviated from the doctrine, the Church didn't hesitate to punish, including excommunication and the most severe forms of censorship and persecution. Therefore, the Church not only shaped the content of medieval education but also its purpose: to teach not for individual or intellectual development, but for the building of Christian faith and religious morality. Discipline in medieval education was harsh and often unforgiving. Medieval society, as a whole, was governed by a rigid hierarchical structure and a deep respect for authority. This was directly reflected in schools and monasteries. The educational system of the time was not only intended to teach but also to shape students in accordance with the strict norms of the Church and society. Physical punishments were common and accepted, both as a form of discipline and as a way to correct students' behavior. Punishments varied but were generally severe. The use of rods, whips, and other implements of punishment was an everyday practice. Children who were negligent or lazy in their studies were harshly corrected. These punishments were not only a way to maintain order, they also reflected a worldview where suffering and obedience were seen as forms of purification and learning. Medieval schools, especially in monasteries, did not have the welcoming or friendly environment we imagine today. Students spent long hours of hard work with little time for leisure or rest. What we now call rigid education would have been unthinkable at the time. The authority of the teacher was absolute, and any attempt to deviate from the established discipline was punished severely. For the boys studying in the Church, this system of punishments was a way to demonstrate devotion and discipline, reflecting the religious values of obedience. However, this method of teaching was not unanimous. Many teachers believed that pain and suffering were necessary forms of helping shape the students' morality and minds. The idea was that through suffering, children could be disciplined and guided to a path of virtue and salvation. Thus, corporal punishment was seen as a legitimate educational tool, and teachers were rarely questioned about this practice. For many, this approach was part of the learning process itself. Despite the severity of the system, there were also moments of reward and recognition. Children who excelled in their academic or religious skills were acknowledged and, in some cases, publicly praised. However, the rigid discipline and use of physical punishment were a reflection of an educational system that was much more concerned with moral behavior than with fostering intellectual freedom. Therefore, medieval education was deeply tied to morality, and education did not merely mean acquiring knowledge but learning how to live according to the Church's precepts. In the Middle Ages, the school curriculum was very different from what we know today. Medieval schools and universities were extremely focused on religious themes, as the purpose of education was closely tied to the propagation of the Christian faith. For much of the medieval period, theology was the central subject. With a deep focus on interpreting the Bible and other sacred texts, education was primarily aimed at training the clergy, who would be responsible for disseminating religious teachings and maintaining social order. However, the medieval curriculum was not limited to religion alone. In monastery schools, for example, the study of classical Greek and Roman texts began to gain ground, but always within a Christian perspective. Philosophy, grammar, rhetoric, and logic were some of the subjects taught. This education aimed to provide students with the necessary tools to understand and interpret both the scriptures and the ancient philosophical texts, which were seen as compatible with the Christian faith. As universities began to emerge, especially from the 12th century onward, the curriculum expanded. The University of Bologna, for example, specialized in canon and civil law, while the University of Paris was known for its theological approach. Medicine also became an important discipline, with an emphasis on studying ancient medical texts, such as those of Galen and Hippocrates. always with a religious perspective, as doctors were seen as agents of healing who should be in harmony with God. However, access to this knowledge was restricted to a minority of the population. Medieval education was not democratic, and universities, when they emerged, were primarily intended for the children of the nobility or the church. For peasants in the lower classes, formal education was virtually non-existent, and learning was more focused on transmitting practical skills for life in the fields or in trade. In many cases, education was limited to basic literacy, if available, and was primarily offered in parish schools or local churches. Furthermore, teaching in medieval universities was dominated by oral tradition. There were no books or learning resources as we have today. Lectures were given in Latin, the language of the church, and content was transmitted orally. Students had to memorize and repeat what was taught, making learning a laborious and exhausting process. Exams were also oral, and academic performance was assessed based on the student's ability to recite and discuss the texts studied, always within the Christian and moral worldview of the time. The medieval curriculum, therefore, was deeply rooted in the religious needs of society. Even subjects we now consider more universal, such as philosophy and science, were taught in a way that reflected the medieval Christian worldview, where knowledge was not just a tool for understanding the world, but also for social and spiritual control. What was learned in medieval schools and universities was directly related to preserving order and maintaining religious faith. The transition to medieval universities marked a significant shift in the educational structure of the Middle Ages. Until the 12th century, education was mainly confined to monasteries, cathedrals, and a few parish schools. These educational institutions were primarily focused on religious formation, preparing young people for clerical life. However, with the growth of cities and the rise of commerce, social needs began to change. The development of universities was a response to these changes, reflecting the desire to expand knowledge and offer a broader education. The first medieval universities emerged in cities that were already growing and becoming centers of commerce and culture. Bologna, in Italy, and Paris, in France, were among the first to be established. These universities were not like today's institutions, where access is open to all types of students. In the Middle Ages, universities were aimed at a small elite, mostly children of the nobility and clergy who wanted to delve into fields like law, medicine, and theology. Academic studies were strongly tied to the church, which controlled the curricula and research. Even in universities, theology continued to be the dominant discipline, with other fields of study always aimed at serving religion. The University of Bologna, for example, was founded in 1088 and specialized in law, particularly canon law. The University of Paris, founded in the 12th century, was a vital center for theological studies. Education in medieval universities was an intensely academic experience, but also very rigorous. The teaching method was largely based on disputes and oral debates, where students discussed texts and differing viewpoints in search of the truth, always within the limits of Christian doctrine. Students in medieval universities were taught in Latin, the language of the church and academia, meaning that access to knowledge was limited to a small intellectual elite. While there was an emphasis on classical texts from philosophy and science, this knowledge was always viewed through the lens of faith, and any teaching that challenged the church was not permitted. Education in universities was deeply intertwined with spirituality, with many teachers and students seeking not only academic knowledge but also a deeper understanding of Christian morality and ethics. As universities spread across Europe, other cities began to become centers of learning. Oxford in England and Salamanca in Spain became new hubs of higher education, reflecting a society increasingly concerned with education as a tool for social advancement. However, access to universities was still limited, and the costs associated with education restricted it to the higher classes of society. Medieval university education, though more advanced than the monastic system, was still an exclusive privilege for the few. The transition to medieval universities represented a great evolution in thinking and learning. Universities helped preserve ancient knowledge and created a foundation for the development of academic knowledge that would expand in later periods, even with its limitations and inequalities. They marked the beginning of a new era of higher education and reflected the growing value placed on knowledge in the medieval world, always guided by religious morality and the Christian worldview. So, what did you think of this journey through time? If you enjoyed it, don't forget to hit that like button and subscribe to the channel to keep exploring more about history in a fun and interesting way. See you in the next video.